Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents No Better Friend, Young Readers Edition, A Man, a Dog, and Their Incredible True Story of Friendship and Survival in World War II, by Robert Weintraub, narrated by P.J. Ochlan. Courage is not having the strength to go on. It is going on when you don't have the strength. Theodore Roosevelt. Prologue. The dog watched from the shadows of the jungle. Something was about to happen. Something bad. The dog, a female, could always sense these moments. A powerful nose could detect human emotions very clearly. Anger and fear were coming in strong waves from the clearing a few hundred feet away. These were common emotions in this forgotten corner of World War II, and the dog sensed them a lot. The dog was, incredibly enough, an official prisoner of war, and had lived with POWs held by the Japanese Army for years. There had been close scrapes along the way. The dog was constantly hiding from the guards, zipping in and out of trouble. Usually the dog's best friend, another prisoner, would call or whistle or snap his fingers. Then the dog would know when to move. But not this time. A guard in a gray-green uniform was screaming. He held a weapon often used by these enraged men. It was a long stick, one just like those the dog often chewed on in the forest. A man was cowering on the ground, waiting for the blows from the screaming guard to rain down on his head and body. Then the guard started to beat the man with the stick. It was time for action. The dog raced out of the bush, barking like crazy. The guard was startled. He backed away from the beaten man, who lay on the ground helpless. The dog forced herself between the guard and the scared man. When the dog was sure the guard was watching her, she moved away. The guard followed, forgetting about the man on the ground. He put the stick down and picked up another weapon, something long and thin. The dog knew what this was. It was also used to threaten and to hurt. Many times before, angry men had fired something at her from this loud, dangerous device. It was time to run. The dog heard her best friend shout, "Judy, disappear!" The dog didn't turn to look, just jumped for the cover of the trees. Then another sound. The weapon being used. The dog felt the heat and the sting. She disappeared into the shadows once more. Her best friend watched, breathing heavily, shocked and silent. Was Judy alive or dead? 1. Frank and Judy. World War II would bring them together, but it took a while before Frank Williams met Judy, the dog who would become his best friend. They came of age a world apart. Judy was born in 1936 in Shanghai, China, in a kennel for dogs belonging to British citizens. When she was just a few weeks old, Judy escaped from her outdoor pen to run free in the busy, dangerous city. She wasn't ready to be on her own when she was so young and delicate. She nearly starved, but a kindly shopkeeper provided her with enough food to survive. One day, some Japanese sailors entered the store. There was an argument, and the sailors beat up the old shop owner. Judy came in to investigate, and one of the Japanese men kicked her across the street. This turned out to be a lucky break for the young English pointer, for she was discovered shortly afterward shivering in a doorway by a girl who worked at Judy's kennel. The girl brought the pup back for a warm bath and a large supper. She also gave the dog a name, calling her Judy, which meant peaceful one in the local Chinese dialect. The head of the kennel, a British woman, changed this to Judy. Within a few weeks, Judy was adopted. Most dogs in the kennel were placed in local homes, but Judy's new home was a boat. A warship, actually. England kept a small part of its Royal Navy in China, and a fleet of small maneuverable gunboats sailed on the Yangtze River, the largest river in the country and the third longest in the world. The gunboats protected British commercial interests in the area, fighting local pirates and warlords when they threatened Western trade. Judy was taken in by the sailors aboard one of these gunboats, HMS Nat. She was meant to be the ship's mascot, but quickly proved to be more than that. Her barks provided warnings when pirates approached, and she showed an uncanny ability to sense when aircraft were nearby. This proved especially useful when war broke out between China and Japan in 1937. While the British were officially neutral, all Western ships, including American boats, were harassed and occasionally attacked by Japanese planes. Judy howled, barked, and generally made a racket when she detected a plane in the area. The gunboat crew knew what that meant. Get to the guns pronto. Time and again, Judy surely saved the boat with her warnings. Once, though, she herself needed rescue. Early in her time aboard the Nat, she fell overboard. The Yangtze River is muddy and fast-running, and Judy wasn't a natural swimmer. Fortunately, a sailor immediately yelled, "Man overboard." Wrong species, right spirit. A motorboat was sent out to fetch Judy before she could drown. If that was the low light of Judy's time in China, the highlight was the birth of her puppies. She became enamored of another English pointer named Paul, who was aboard a French gunboat on the Yangtze. Shortly afterward, Judy became a mother. She gave birth to a litter of 10 puppies, who soon swarmed the ship on their chubby little legs, gnawing on slipcovers, ammo belts, canvas sails, and everything else that wasn't metal. They also left puddles all over the boat. Because of the trouble they caused, the pups were given away, mostly to lucky local families. Judy met many of these locals when she headed ashore with her crewmates. A favorite canteen offered a delicious assortment of ice cream, and Judy quickly learned to love the sweet stuff, always begging for a bowlful. Once her plaintive whines went unanswered, so she ambled behind the bar and pulled out a large carton of vanilla, which she dragged into the center of the room. After that, she always received her scoop in short order. She also ambled along with her crewmates on exercise runs and played soccer and field hockey with them. She would play on both teams in hockey, dashing in to grab the ball and deposit it in whichever goal struck her fancy. When the game ended, the sailors subtracted Judy's goals from the total score to determine the winner. One thing she never did, however, was point, the very hunting age she was bred to perform. She couldn't grasp the method of standing stiffly and staring towards birds in the bushes so that the crew could shoot them for dinner, but she was great at alerting her friends to danger. Judy would happily have gone on living a fulfilling life in China, but the threat of World War was gathering, and she was, after all, in the service of the Royal Navy. First, she was transferred to a new gunboat, HMS Grasshopper, which was bigger and faster than the Nat. She followed along as the Grasshopper was transferred out of China to Singapore, site of Britain's largest naval base in the Pacific. Frank Williams wound up in Singapore as well, though he wouldn't meet his future best friend in the Lion City. He grew up in the seaside town of Portsmouth, England. Frank was born in 1919. His father died when Frank was young. Frank and his 5 brothers and sisters, he was the second oldest, shared a small house with another family. A crowded situation Frank did his best to escape as often as possible. When he was a kid, this meant tooling around town on his bicycle. But once he turned 16, Frank joined the Merchant Navy, the British version of the American Merchant Marine, working on a ship as it carried supplies around the world. A few years later, with war threatening Europe, Frank joined the Royal Air Force, RAF. He loved flying and airplanes, but alas, he was too tall to be a pilot. Instead, he became a mechanic, specializing in radar systems, which at the time represented a brand new, vital technology that would allow Frank and other radar men to detect the presence of enemy aircraft in time to prepare for an attack. Frank arrived in Singapore with a new top-secret radar unit in the summer of 1941. The Sino-Japanese War. China and Japan are two of Asia's largest countries and have a long history of fighting each other. In 1937, while Judy was serving with the gunboat fleet on the Yangtze River, Japan invaded China, kicking off the Sino-Japanese War. Sino means Chinese, much like Anglo means English. Japan is much smaller than China and needs to get food and important materials from other countries. Japan often looked to China to supply these goods, sometimes taking them by force. In addition to needing a steady stream of supplies from China, Japan wanted to create an empire much the way Great Britain had done, by ruling other countries. China was a natural place to start, since the country was so huge that it was hard to defend and govern. Japan sent forces to the northern part of China, called Manchuria, and became friendly with the warlords in charge of the region. Japan received food and other goods in return. But that wasn't enough. So next, Japan invaded the main part of China. Japan claimed that its soldiers were fired upon by Chinese forces near Beijing at a place called the Marco Polo Bridge. In response, Japan sent its soldiers into China, and Japan's Air Force began bombing China's cities. At first, the Japanese easily took territory, but the Chinese fought much harder than anyone thought they would. Japan had a more modern army, but China had the advantage of fighting on its own territory. The war was very brutal, as the Japanese killed many thousands of civilians living in big Chinese cities, and eventually settled into a stalemate when it was clear neither side could fully win. Then World War II began, and Japan looked for the goods it wanted from other countries in Asia. The fighting in China mostly quieted, as Japan fought in many other places. World War II. The Second World War began on September 1, 1939, a little more than 2 decades after the First World War ended in 1918. Germany was on the losing end of that first war, and the resulting loss of prestige and economic might led to the rise of the Nazi Party, with Adolf Hitler as its leader. Hitler quickly rebuilt the German military and began a policy of expansion. After taking over a few surrounding areas, including Austria and part of Czechoslovakia, Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 was the final straw for France and England, the principal nations opposing Germany. They declared war, beginning what would become nearly 6 years of war in Europe, eventually drawing in the United States, before Hitler and the Nazis were at last defeated. World War II in the Pacific began later, in 1941, as the result of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Much like the Germans, the Japanese had upset the balance of power in the region by aggressively expanding its empire. For several years, war was conducted by economic means. America cut off sales of oil and other important materials to Japan, which only made the small island nation more desperate to procure natural resources. This conflict was principally between Japan and the U.S., though Great Britain was also involved, which is how Judy and Frank Williams eventually became prisoners of war. 2. Singapore. Judy spent the months before the start of the Pacific War. The war was already well underway in Europe by now, performing routine patrol duties aboard the Grasshopper and relaxing in the homes of local officials in the Singapore government and military. Frank's radar unit didn't have it so good. Immediately, problems cropped up. Equipment failed, and replacement parts were hard to come by. The ancient planes they had to work with, far less modern than the RAF aircraft that had won the Battle of Britain, weren't up to snuff. But there was no fighting yet, and the men enjoyed Singapore greatly. On December 7, 1941, that changed drastically. The Japanese attacked the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was part of a broader wave of invasions across the Pacific by the Japanese, one that included Siam, now Thailand, and Malaya, now Malaysia. Both nations were close to Singapore, the center of strength for the British Empire in Asia. The island had a huge military presence, including the large naval base, and it was considered invulnerable. Certainly few there were concerned about the Japanese. This turned out to be a mistake, because the Japanese, led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, swept through the British defenses in a matter of weeks. By February, they had conquered Siam and Malaya and were entering Singapore itself. Frank and the Air Force he served with were ineffective, and the Japanese established total air superiority over Singapore. They sank the majority of Britain's large naval ships in the Pacific and relentlessly pummeled the troops on the ground. Fewer than 2 weeks later, the British were forced, incredibly, to surrender. Singapore was in shock at how fast it had all happened. Many civilians and military personnel were evacuated aboard the few ships that had yet to be sunk by the Japanese, one of which was Judy's Grasshopper. The ship was at anchor in Singapore's Keppel Harbor. Frank was among the lucky few allowed to leave. Most servicemen were left behind and were taken captive by the Japanese. As Japan's army advanced, Keppel Harbor was crowded with refugees of all types. There were retreating soldiers, stoic government workers, terrified Chinese, and stunned colonial families. Some staggered along with everything they owned. Others took nothing save the clothing they wore. All had their eyes on the prize, a place aboard one of the ragtag group of ships that swung at anchor in the harbor, waiting to take them away from the invading Japanese. Wave after wave of refugees crushed toward the makeshift fleet of rescue vessels. It was February 12th, 1942. Judy watched the chaos below from the deck of the Grasshopper. If the mayhem made her particularly nervous, she didn't show it. She sat quietly near the rail, occasionally walking to the other end of the ship, only to return, as if transfixed by the display on the pier. Judy's nose was incredibly powerful. She had a much better sense of smell than the people all around her. And that was tough, because the harbor stank. The usual waterfront stench of rotting vegetation, fish, and fuel was mixed with the reek of raw sewage and the overpowering stink of the bombed-out city. The horrible smells of scorched rubber, wood burnt to ash, and the victims of the Japanese invasion made people retch. Meanwhile, the bombs continued to fall, many right there on the docks. Long stretches of inaction as the Royal Navy attempted an orderly boarding and escape were interrupted by dizzying moments of horror as Japanese bombers nicknamed Nels appeared out of nowhere. The shriek of a bomb's approach would join with the cries of those trying to escape it. And then an explosion, often quieter or less dramatic than many expected. Many bombs missed badly, landing in the harbor, sending up fountains of dark water, or, in the city, smashing the homes the people in the harbor had just left, causing flames to leap into the darkening sky. But some bombs struck the dock area, and Judy's floppy ears heard the sounds of people screaming and moaning. But Judy was a veteran war dog by now, thanks to her service in China. She had seen plenty of suffering and shots fired in anger there. So she remained calm, occasionally running under the steel cover of the bridge when the noise of falling bombs cut through the air. Her ability to sense danger was keeping her alive. But for how much longer? The Battle of Britain. In 1940, Germany invaded and conquered France. After that, Germany held virtually all of Western Europe in its grip, except for Great Britain. The Brits had one big defensive advantage: the English Channel, the body of water that separates the British Isles from the continent of Europe. Because of the Channel, Germany couldn't simply keep marching and overrun the Brits. It would have to bomb England first, then invade the weakened country by ship. So began the Battle of Britain. Germany sent bombers across the Channel almost every day during the summer and fall of 1940. Frank's friends in the RAF sent fighter planes up to stop the bombers. Germany's goal was to knock out enough of the RAF to gain control of the skies, establishing what is called air superiority. But Germany never did manage to do it. British and some American pilots were brave and skilled, shooting down enough German planes to win this long battle. Eventually, Germany decided not to invade England at all. Instead, it turned east and took on the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, gave a famous speech recognizing the bravery of the RAF by saying, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese military unleashed a shocking surprise attack on the huge U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The blow led directly to America's declaring war and entering World War II. The operation began when the Japanese Navy sent aircraft carriers within striking distance of Pearl. At dawn on a Sunday morning, more than 350 planes attacked the base, dropping bombs and firing machine guns at the American ships docked there. Most of Pearl was still asleep when the attack came. More than 2,400 people were killed and over 1,100 wounded. Japan had decided to attack Pearl Harbor in order to destroy the U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific Ocean so that Japan could invade and dominate countries in the Pacific without worrying about America's large naval force trying to stop it. But although the attack was successful, it wasn't complete. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, as were many other ships, and almost 200 American airplanes. But fortunately for the U.S. Navy, several aircraft carriers were not at Pearl and were not hit, so they could strike back at Japan in the coming months. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States immediately declared war on Japan, and soon after on Japan's ally, Germany. Many Americans didn't want to fight the war before Pearl Harbor, but after the sneak attack, almost everybody was so angry that minds changed overnight. 3. Flight. The next day, around mid-morning, the gunboats were ordered to take on passengers and be ready to leave that evening. Judy was excited, hopping about as the first of the refugees piled onto the Grasshopper. For these unfortunate people, all had been well merely 9 weeks before. They were living peaceful lives, filled with family, friends, careers, education, and fun. With sickening speed, all of it had been wrenched away by the invading Japanese. Hopes and dreams were gone, along with many of their possessions and their sense of home. Now survival was all that mattered. One of Judy's best human friends on the Grasshopper was George White. Coincidentally, he came from Frank's hometown, Portsmouth. George was in charge of the ship's food and water supplies, and he had to scramble to find a way to feed the new mouths on board, managing to come up with a cup of tea and a slab of chocolate for every passenger. Meanwhile, Judy was doing her best to settle the civilians. She was seen constantly nuzzling up to the many crying, frightened children, hoping to give them a familiar and friendly sight, and personally greeted virtually everyone on board, according to George. Nearby was another gunboat from the Yangtze River, the Dragonfly, along with numerous smaller ships. Two of these were SS Tianquang and HMS Koala, tanker steamers that were now part of the Royal Navy. Frank and his fellow RAF radarmen were on their way to escape aboard the Tianquang. It hadn't exactly been a glorious war thus far for Frank Williams. His radar systems worked badly, if at all, and his Air Force had been chased from the sky by the Japanese. Now he was retreating madly from an army he and his countrymen had considered harmless mere weeks before. Upon their arrival at the pier, the RAF evacuees were pointed toward the Tianquang, and Frank waited in a long line while he and the other 265 radarmen prepared to board, along with numerous Army personnel and a handful of civilians. Next door to Tianquang, the other converted steamer, Koala, had been loaded to bursting, stuffed with refugees and whatever belongings they could squeeze on board. In all, it sailed with between 500 and 600 people. Judy's boat, the Grasshopper, captained by Commander Jack Hoffman, pulled away from the docks for good. Screams from the unfortunate civilians left behind trailed the boat as it powered into the harbor. The Dragonfly followed. Out ahead of the gunboats, Tianquang and Koala were tacking a different course in the same direction. They were all headed for the same place, the city of Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies. The city and the country have since been renamed Jakarta and Indonesia. A large Western presence there promised immediate safety and the likelihood of larger ships for escape to India, Ceylon, or Australia. But to get to Batavia, they needed to sail across long stretches of ocean, where the Japanese were waiting for them. 4. Attack. The wind howled through Judy's ears as the gunboats pushed hard under the comforting cloak of darkness. The pointer should have been deeply asleep, but noise and people and fear kept her from anything but brief snoozing. She curled up near George on occasion, but just as often lent her comforting presence to the many scared civilians on board. The ship was packed from stem to stern with refugees, most dirty and disheveled, all exhausted by their ordeal. They slept anywhere they could find an unclaimed spot. Judy's warm fur and cold nose were something familiar and happy for them. Nothing else was. Finally, the sun rose, and with it the dread aboard the gunboats. As the new day, February 14, 1942, began, Japanese flight operations were beginning, and scout planes were taking to the sky. Bomber crews were breakfasting, likely confident of the damage they would inflict that day. Everyone on the Grasshopper, except Judy, knew this could well be their last day on Earth. The strong among them buried the thought and carried on. For about 2 hours, the gunboats made good progress. But a few minutes past 9 a.m., their luck ran out. After her fitful night, Judy had been quiet as day broke, content to make her way around the deck and lie panting in the heat. But now she began a sharp barking. The crew knew what that meant and looked up to the skies. Sure enough, a Japanese seaplane appeared above. It immediately commenced a dive attack, dropping one bomb at the Grasshopper that missed badly, then turning and tossing another bomb at Dragonfly. This one was a much better attempt, exploding close enough to the gunboat to cause slight but not critical damage to its bow. The seaplane disappeared, but that was small comfort to those on board the gunboats. The seaplane's big brothers now knew where they were, and a mission was being planned as the damage was assessed. By 11:30, land had been spotted, and the gunboats closed to within 2 miles of the island of Posick, a tiny extension of lava and sand that scarcely poked out of the water. Bombers soon appeared in formation out of the south. Aircraft off the port beam, someone shouted. Judy was barking madly at them, and the anti-aircraft guns opened up.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?